Welcome to the deep dive. We often talk about empires in terms of, well, monumental stone, don't we? You think of the towering columns of Persepolis, or maybe those expansive borders you see drawn on a map.
Huge empires, yeah.
Exactly. But today, we want to look past that sort of surface grandeur to examine the hidden scaffolding of power in the ancient Persian Empire. Specifically, we're zooming in on the Achaemenid period.
A crucial time.
And our focus isn't the kings, not the great battles we always hear about, but a particular class of people, individuals who were, kind of paradoxically, the most trusted and often the most vulnerable figures in that entire civilization. We're talking about the male eunuchs.
It's such an essential shift in perspective, really. The Achaemenid Empire, I mean, it was colossal, the largest the world had seen up to that point, stretching across continents.
Unbelievable scale.
Right, and to manage that kind of scale, the kings of kings, as they called themselves, they needed absolute, unshakable loyalty right there at the heart of the royal court.
Makes sense.
So our mission today, really, is to try and distill the human cost involved in achieving that loyalty. And to understand the mechanisms of control, the systems that shape the lives, the identities of literally thousands of men who were chosen, transformed, and basically constrained by the state.
Yeah, we're peeling back the marble facade of places like Susa and Persepolis. Because when you imagine the sheer opulence of that royal court, you know, the gold, the jewels, the incredible political influence swirling around, you also have to confront this grim reality of state-sanctioned institutional violence that underpinned it all. This mandated servant class, often selected as young boys, children really, their lives were entirely dictated by imperial decree from that moment on.
And that brings us straight to the core paradox of their position, doesn't it? Why would such a sophisticated, such an expansive empire rely on what seems like, well, such a cruel system?
It does seem counterintuitive.
The answer, in a word, is dynastic security. The ancient Near East, you have to remember, was absolutely rife with palace coups, struggles for succession, betrayals, constant instability.
Exactly. So the Achaemenid rulers needed a loyal servant class, people who could operate in the most intimate, the most sensitive spaces. We're talking the royal bedchambers, the treasury, the harem, without ever posing a biological threat to the royal lineage.
Ah, okay, so their inability to reproduce. That wasn't just a physical side effect, it was the point. It was the ultimate political guarantee.
Precisely.
It meant they couldn't father rivals, couldn't start their own competing dynasty down the line.
Yeah.
Their physical alteration was deliberately transformed from, a personal tragedy into a key political asset.
That's exactly it. They were, in the king's eyes, trustworthy, precisely because they were permanently severed from that possibility of having a family legacy, of playing a role in succession. They became effectively property of the empire.
Wow.
And that fact was irrevocably etched into their flesh. They became indispensable because they theoretically had no alternate loyalty, no wife, no children, no family interest that could possibly supersede their devotion to the throne, or so the thinking went. And that profound human cost, that transformation, that's really what we want to focus on today. This deep dive, it's an act of recognition, isn't it?
I think it has to be.
We need to acknowledge the resilience, yes, but also the fundamental humanity behind what can seem like just a historical abstraction. And maybe challenge ourselves to confront these darker mechanisms of power that used identity, used bodily control as tools of statecraft.
Okay, so if the role of the eunuch was fundamentally political, as you've laid out, the start of their life and service was anything but abstract. It was relentlessly personal and, frankly, brutal.
Let's dig into that selection process. You mentioned it wasn't random.
No, not at all. This wasn't some kind of arbitrary lottery. It was a calculated campaign executed across the vastness of the empire.
How did it work in practice? Who were they looking for?
Well, the selection was a very strategic process. It was designed to minimize resistance from families and local communities and maximize the dependence of the chosen boy on the state. Imperial agents, and these could be part of tax collection units or attached to military expeditions, they would systematically scour towns and villages.
Where, though? Were they targeting specific regions?
Often, yes. Particularly in conquered lands or, the more far-flung provinces, places like Phrygia, Cappadocia, maybe some of the Circassian coastal towns, areas where the populations were perhaps seen as foreign, subjugated, and crucially, lacked the political clout to really push back against imperial demands.
So it sounds like a system designed almost explicitly to target the most vulnerable populations. Boys may be plucked from lower social strata, where economic hardship or just the sheer force of imperial authority could silence any objection from the family.
That seems to be largely right. Forcible removal was absolutely key. The sources, like Herodotus and Xenophon, they tell us these agents operated with supreme authority cloaked in the emperor's decree.
I can only imagine the terror.
Imagine it. For a small village, when the king's men arrived with this specific purpose, it must have been terrifying. One moment, you have these boys, maybe 7, 8, 10 years old, playing in a sunlit courtyard, maybe thinking about farming their father's land or perhaps dreaming of joining the army one day.
Just being kids.
Just being kids. And the next moment, they're torn from home, their entire future violently redirected by the state's will. The removal was usually immediate, swift. It was designed, in part, to demonstrate the ultimate reach of the emperor's power over human life itself. A very stark message.
And this abrupt, traumatic transition led immediately to the next step, the castration ritual, a kind of violent passage that cemented their new status as, essentially, state property.
We need to be clear about this procedure, I think, because the sheer brutality is central to understanding their later psychological state, their whole existence, really.
Yes, we do. This wasn't surgery in any modern sense. It was an act of terrifying, institutionalized violence. It was performed using, well, rudimentary methods, often by people with absolutely no specialized medical training. Who would do it?
Sometimes slaves, sometimes other eunuchs who had survived it themselves, maybe local practitioners who were coerced by the imperial agents. The critical points are the utter lack of sanitation, no concept of antiseptics, and most horrifically, no anesthesia.
None at all.
None. The agonizing pain was integral to the process. It wasn't just a side effect, it was a psychological assertion of dominance. A breaking down.
The survival rate, I mean, given those conditions, it must have been shockingly low.
It's hard to get precise figures from antiquity, of course, but historical accounts and later medical analysis strongly suggest that, yeah, depending on the method used, the age of the boy, the conditions, mortality rates could range wildly, but they were certainly high, very high.
What were the immediate dangers?
Severe hemorrhage was a major risk, overwhelming infection, septic shock. These were common and immediate threats. If a boy did survive the initial procedure, the physical trauma often left lasting scars, both internally and externally. This wasn't some quick, sterile act. It was a permanent, irreversible assertion that their bodies, their very beings, belonged entirely to the crown.
And you mentioned before, this procedure wasn't just about removing the capacity to reproduce biologically. It was, as you said, a political strategy,
Yeah.
a violent severing of identity.
Absolutely. The procedure quite literally erased the boy's future as a potential father, as a holder of a family lineage. It fundamentally altered his identity within the existing social structure. In a society like Ancient Persia, where legacy and, frankly, masculinity were often tied directly to the ability to sire children and participate fully in civic life, they were thrust into this painful, liminal space.
That term liminal, it keeps coming up in the source material when discussing eunuchs. Can you unpack what that actually entails in this context? What does it mean to exist in a liminal space in ancient Persia?
It means they existed between the clearly defined categories of the time. They were no longer considered boys, obviously, but they couldn't become men in the traditional civic sense. Either they couldn't lead armies in the usual way, couldn't inherit property in the usual way, couldn't continue a family line.
So marked physically, socially marginalized?
Yes, physically marked, often socially marginalized, yet paradoxically, potentially politically privileged. They didn't fully belong to the masculine world of warfare and public decision-making, nor did they belong to the secluded feminine world of the harem, but they could uniquely act as intermediaries between both.
That's fascinating.
But the trauma of that physical alteration and the resulting social ambiguity, it didn't just end when the physical wound healed, if it ever truly did. It really began the moment they survived the procedure. It marked the start of a lifelong internal struggle trying to reconcile their own sense of self with this imposed role, this identity as essentially property of the empire.
Okay, so despite this horrific beginning, this trauma, these survivors, the ones who made it through, often found themselves in positions of really staggering political importance. And this is the paradox we need to unpack, isn't it? How did individuals who were victims of such extreme violence become these indispensable figures of power right at the heart of the imperial court?
It's the central irony, isn't it? Their very vulnerability, the thing that marked them, was precisely their strength in the eyes of the king. Because they were perceived as being fundamentally unable to challenge the dynastic line, their trustworthiness was considered, well, almost absolute.
Safer than a nobleman with sons and ambitions.
Exactly, safer than a general with loyal troops. That physical mark of castration was, bizarrely, the greatest possible symbol of loyalty the system could devise. It was the brutal price of admission to the inner circle, and it effectively transformed a bodily injury, a source of potential shame, into a supreme political asset.
So their utility, derived from this alteration, guaranteed their proximity to power. Let's delve into their core roles within that imperial machinery. Because, as you hinted, they weren't just passive servants, they were active administrators, sometimes spies, guardians.
Their duties were incredibly multi-layered, placing them right at the nexus of power. Firstly, and perhaps the role most famously associated with them, was guardianship of the harem, the royal quarters housing the king's wives, concubines, children, and female relatives.
But this wasn't just standing outside a door with a spear,
Oh,
right?
far from it. They weren't just guards. They were essentially the managers, sometimes doctors or nurses to the women, the logistics experts running what amounted to a massive, highly sensitive and politically charged household. They ensured the security, yes, but also the privacy of the king's women. This placed them as silent, and sometimes not so silent, witnesses to intimate family dramas, potential political maneuverings, rivalries between queens, things that could destabilize the entire court if they spilled out.
And that unique access, being privy to the royal family's private lives and connected to the administration, that must have given them an incredible intelligence advantage. Knowledge is definitely currency in any royal court.
Absolutely. The knowledge they accumulated within the harem, who was in favor, who was out, what alliances were forming, what grievances were simmering, could translate directly into political influence outside its walls. They often became the key intermediaries.
How so?
Well, imagine a powerful queen wanting to convey a sensitive political request or a piece of intelligence to the king, but wanting to do it discreetly without alerting the jealous noblemen waiting in the public audience hall. The eunuch was the perfect, theoretically neutral conduit. They could bridge that gap between the secluded female quarters and the public, male-dominated political sphere in a way almost no one else could.
Okay, so beyond the harem, they became indispensable in high administration too. The sources suggest they held some incredibly sensitive financial and logistical posts.
That's where their influence often truly expanded and solidified. Because they couldn't found their own dynasty, and because any wealth they accumulated often reverted to the crown upon their death or went to a designated heir approved by the king, they were frequently entrusted with the royal treasury.
Less temptation to embezzle for their own family line.
That was the rationale, yes. So they were appointed as chief administrators, keepers of the royal seal, a position of immense trust, and sometimes even as regional governors or satraps, overseeing vast territories. This gave them control over things like tax collection, diplomatic correspondence, managing the state archives, and directing the flow of resources vital for running such a massive empire.
Can we anchor this with a specific example? You mentioned the sources hinting at eunuchs whose power rivaled even the most prominent noble families.
Indeed, we have figures like Bagoas in the later Achaemenid period, the 4th century BCE. He wasn't just a servant, he was effectively the power behind the throne for a time. Sources like Diodorus Siculus tell us he poisoned kings, installed successors, commanded armies, assassinated rivals, and negotiated treaties. He essentially governed the empire through a succession of weaker kings he manipulated.
Wow, that's incredible power.
It demonstrates that proximity to the king, combined with control over information and finance, meant that a highly capable eunuch could potentially wield power greater than that of most hereditary princes or nobles. They accumulated vast personal wealth, immense prestige, and became confidants and counselors whose influence extended far beyond the palace walls and deep into broader governance.
But as we keep saying, this towering influence existed in this constant, almost unbearable tension with their fundamental status, well, as altered individuals, almost property. They were the ultimate insiders, privy to every secret, yet they were somehow permanently outsiders in the broader society.
That contradiction really defined their entire existence. On the one hand, yes, they could enjoy unparalleled privileges, access to the king, often the best education available, material comforts, political weight denied to the vast majority of people in the empire. But on the other hand, they were permanently barred from the core components of ancient male identity, creating a lineage, full participation in civic life as a normal citizen, military command in the traditional sense, although some did command troops under specific royal decree.
And the hereditary noble class, the Persian aristocracy, they must have resented them bitterly. These figures who hadn't inherited their power but gained it through proximity and, well, their physical alteration.
Immensely. The sources hint at constant friction. They were subject to perpetual suspicion and prejudice from the traditional nobility. The nobles often viewed the eunuch's status as a kind of moral aberration, a physical weakness that somehow didn't justify their power, or simply as an unnatural acquisition of influence.
Dangerous parvenus, perhaps. Upstarts.
Exactly. Upstarts who had gained authority through perceived manipulation or royal favor, rather than through birthright and land ownership, which were the traditional markers of status for the aristocracy. This meant their survival depended not just on maintaining the king's favor, but on a meticulous level of discretion, displaying unwavering loyalty and using their intelligence to navigate the venomous, competitive social hierarchy of the court. One wrong step could be fatal.
So their entire existence was this constant high-wire negotiation between the ultimate authority conferred by the king and the ultimate vulnerability imposed by society and their physical state.
Precisely. And this was often reinforced by strict social controls imposed upon them. They might be subjected to rigorous codes of behavior designed specifically to enforce their separation from the general populace or even from other court officials. Their movements might be monitored, their interactions limited, reinforcing their status as a specialized, sometimes feared, often resented caste. Their rise to power is really a testament to the fact that the empire was capable of manipulating not just land and armies, but the very identities of its subjects to maintain its internal stability and its rigid hierarchy. Now, we really must pivot to the intimate cost of this existence. Beyond the initial physical trauma of castration, which was horrific enough, the daily reality for many eunuchs was dominated by severe, long-term health issues and arguably even more profound psychological burdens.
Let's start with that long-term physical toll. You mentioned the initial unsanitary surgery often had devastating consequences that didn't just disappear.
No, the physical consequences were pervasive and often lifelong. Chronic infections were incredibly common due to the rudimentary nature of the surgery and the lack of effective treatments. Many likely suffered lifelong issues with internal scarring, which could lead to urinary tract problems, incontinence, and possibly digestive complications as well.
But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence you touched on was the profound hormonal imbalance, the loss of testosterone.
Yes, that's critical. The removal of the testes meant the primary source of testosterone was gone. And this had significant systemic effects on their bodies over time.
What were the observable effects of this hormonal shift, beyond the obvious physiological changes we associate with castration? How did it impact their daily lives?
The effects were manifold and deeply impacted their day-to-day survival and quality of life. The loss of testosterone generally leads to reduced muscle mass and strength, making physical tasks harder. It also often leads to increased fragility of bones, osteoporosis essentially, making them much more susceptible to debilitating fractures later in life.
So physically more vulnerable.
Yes, and their physical appearance often changed too. They might retain a more prepubescent look or develop increased body fat, particularly around the hips and chest, a condition known as gynecomastia. But beyond the visible, they often suffered from constant debilitating fatigue, a kind of chronic exhaustion. And pronounced mood fluctuations could also be common, likely a direct result of their altered endocrine system.
That sounds incredibly difficult to live with, especially under the pressures of court life.
Absolutely. The relentless strain of palace duties, the long hours, the stress, combined with this underlying physical frailty and hormonal disruption. It often significantly shortened their lifespans compared to contemporary free men who hadn't undergone the procedure.
It really underscores the pragmatic cruelty of the empire, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
They were valued as instruments of statecraft, purely for their function, with seemingly little compassion shown for their enduring pain and vulnerability.
Indeed. The empire appeared willing to sacrifice the long-term health and basic well-being of these individuals for the sake of political expediency. Their survival itself became a kind of daily negotiation with chronic pain, systemic vulnerability, and perhaps a compromised immune system as well.
And if the physical cost was so enduring, the psychological burden must have been equally, if not more, immense.
Yeah.
You mentioned profound loneliness and alienation, for instance.
Imagine being systematically, surgically excluded from the most foundational components of human life in that society. Traditional family structures, the simple joy of watching your own children grow up, the sense of generational continuity that defined so much of ancient life. They were denied all of that.
That's a huge void.
It is. They were perpetually grappling with what must have felt like a fractured sense of self. Their core identity was rooted solely in their service to a political entity, the state or the king, not in personal relationships or lineage in the way that anchored most other people's lives.
And they operated under such incredible pressure, too. Constant surveillance, you mentioned. The need to suppress personal desires, the demand for unwavering, almost emotionless service.
That kind of psychological environment lived day in and day out for decades, almost inevitably fostered deep anxiety, perhaps even depression. And added to that was the burden of immense secrecy they often carried.
The palace secrets.
Exactly. They were witnesses to the highest political intrigues, the intimate vulnerabilities and failings of the royal family, possibly even acts of treason, plots, or murder. This knowledge was, in one sense, their source of power and influence, but it also became a profound source of isolation. They were obligated to suppress their personal reactions, their emotions, their judgments, living under the continuous strain of knowing secrets that could literally destroy them or others if revealed.
You mentioned earlier that they existed in this liminal space, challenging the gender binaries of ancient Persia.
Yeah.
How did that ambiguity impact their self-perception and their relationship with the wider world? Did it offer any advantages or just more alienation?
It was likely a source of both, a true contradiction. They were physically marked in a way that prevented them from being seen as traditionally masculine within that society's norms. Yet, paradoxically, they often held immense power in spheres usually dominated by administration, finance, political council.
So that ambiguous status allowed them unique access.
Yes, it could. They could move between the rigidly segregated male and female spaces of the court in a way few others could. They could speak to the queen one moment and the king's general the next. But this very uniqueness likely intensified their alienation from both spheres. Their sense of self, their identity, was fundamentally defined by state control and imperial ambition. Yet, surely, they must have engaged in a lifelong internal struggle to reconcile that imposed role with their own inner sense of worth, humanity, and identity.
It's easy to paint them solely as victims, given everything we've discussed. But despite these overwhelming constraints, the physical toll, the psychological isolation, the social stigma, it would be a mistake, wouldn't it, to view them simply as passive figures. The source material does hint at considerable resilience, even agency, operating in those shadows.
Resilience is absolutely the vital counterbalance to their often tragic fate. They weren't just passive recipients of state policy. Many became masters of navigating complex political systems, and they found subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways to assert agency within the very system that constrained them.
How did that? What are the mechanisms?
One crucial mechanism was solidarity. Despite the competitive court environment, they often formed incredibly close-knit communities within the palace walls. These were like surrogate families, really, relying on shared experience, mutual protection, and understanding.
That shared trauma and unique experience must have been an absolute lifeline in what could be a very hostile environment.
It almost certainly was. These internal communities could provide vital emotional support, form political alliances amongst themselves, offer practical assistance, and perhaps share coping strategies. It was a network of survival.
Beyond solidarity.
Beyond solidarity, many leveraged their intellectual acumen. They were often highly educated, trained in literacy, languages, administration, finance. They became politically savvy operators. Many carved out significant niches of power that became somewhat independent of the king's immediate personal favor. They became indispensable due to their skills as diplomats, financial experts, record keepers, even military strategists in some cases.
So their pursuit of political influence or financial independence where possible was in itself a form of resistance against complete erasure. They were creating a lasting impact despite being barred from leaving a legacy through lineage.
Exactly. It was a way of asserting value and permanence. Some found agency through patronage, mentoring future kings or princes, advising queens, ensuring their political influence extended into the next generation. Others perhaps focused on philosophical or religious pursuits, seeking meaning in a personal legacy that transcended the material limitations and physical constraints of their courtly roles.
Any other ways they created legacy?
Well, occasionally we hear of eunuchs sponsoring art, literature, or architecture, using their accumulated wealth, when they had it, to leave a mark on the world, creating a kind of immortality that was unavailable to them through biological errors. Their ability to adapt, to survive, and in some cases even to thrive despite the immense obstacles, is a powerful testament to the enduring human spirit attempting to assert selfhood even when systematically denied.
So the eunuchs were clearly central, absolutely pivotal to the functioning of the Achaemenid court for a long time. But as we know, no power structure is eternal. As the empire itself began to change, their status started to erode, didn't it? Which really demonstrates the inherent fragility of a status tied purely to political utility rather than something like birthright.
Yes, the ground definitely began to shift beneath their feet. The change accelerated dramatically, of course, with the arrival of Alexander the Great in the 330s BCE. When Alexander conquered Persia, he didn't just replace the king, he brought with him entirely new political paradigms, the culture of the Hellenistic world.
How did that impact the eunuchs specifically?
Well, Macedonian rulers and the Seleucids who followed Alexander in the region operated with different cultural traditions. They had different notions of court loyalty, often relying more heavily on their own Macedonian or Greek companions and loyalists for key administrative and military roles. The specific Persian-inflected need for this particular kind of non-dynastic administrator, while not vanishing entirely, certainly diminished.
So their core political utility, the very reason for their existence in the Persian system, was suddenly undermined by foreign conquest and new ruling elites.
Precisely. And even before Alexander, and certainly after, as the empire fractured or faced internal strife, shifting Persian politics, constant regime changes, and endless factionalism made the eunuchs exceptionally vulnerable. Their status was often intimately tied to the personal favor of a single king or perhaps a powerful queen mother.
So when that patron fell from power,
The eunuch frequently followed, often very quickly. Regardless of his decades of loyal service, his administrative skill, his accumulated knowledge, he could be seen as part of the old, discredited regime.
which meant a profound, ever-present risk of betrayal or disgrace. An influential administrator, maybe someone who had controlled the treasury for decades, could find himself abruptly exiled, imprisoned, or even executed by a new regime that simply viewed him as an outdated political liability, or worse, a threat.
It really highlights the ultimate insecurity of their privileged position. They wielded immense power, yes, but it was always contingent, always dependent on the shifting political climate. The fall from grace could be sudden, total, and brutal, underscoring the fragility of a status built on bodily difference and political dependence, rather than on something more solid like hereditary right or broad popular support.
And alongside the political shifts, we also see cultural attitudes hardening over time. It wasn't just about politics. The social stigma associated with them seems to have intensified, perhaps even among the general populace outside the court.
Yes, there's evidence for that. As the strong centralized Achaemenid control perhaps loosened over centuries, or as different cultural influences came into play, the general public, who may have initially seen them simply as powerful agents of a distant emperor, began perhaps to view them with increasing suspicion, maybe derision, or even pity. Where they were once necessary, if perhaps feared, agents of imperial authority, they could become simply objects of morbid curiosity or moral ambiguity.
How did the religious or philosophical currents of the era play into this? Did they reinforce this marginalization?
It seems likely. In Persia itself, the rise and consolidation of Zoroastrian thought, with its strong emphasis on purity, physical completeness, and the importance of generational continuity through family, presented a challenge. The eunuchs' altered state and their inability to contribute to the next generation could be seen as contradicting some of these core values, potentially framing them, in some interpretations, as transgressive or impure figures.
And later influences.
Later, as Christian and eventually Islamic influences spread across the Near East, various theological and philosophical interpretations continued to grapple with their ambiguous status, often reinforcing their marginalization, especially outside the immediate protective sphere of the palace walls where their utility still mattered most.
Yet, despite all this, the political vulnerability, the hardening social attitudes they still endured, they didn't just vanish entirely from history after the Achaemenid fall, did they?
No, not at all. Their deep institutional knowledge of courtly administration, financial management, palace protocol, and even diplomacy was simply too valuable to discard entirely, even for new rulers. Many adapted. They found ways to make themselves useful to the new Hellenistic kings, or later to the Parthian and Sasanian powers that rose in Persia.
So they transferred their skills.
Essentially, yes. They remained essential cogs in the machinery of government, necessary for managing the sheer complexity of governing vast multicultural territories. In a way, their fate mirrored the fortunes of the empire itself. They moved from being arguably indispensable central figures in the unique Achaemenid system to becoming often more peripheral, yet still crucial, specialized administrators in subsequent courts throughout the region. Their roles might have shifted, but their presence continued.
But the tragic fate of many, particularly those who lost favor, were simply aged out of usefulness. It must have been incredibly lonely and bleak.
That is the ultimate poignancy of their story, I think. After years, sometimes decades, of bearing the empire's secrets, managing its wealth, and serving its most intimate needs, many were simply discarded by the very system they had upheld. Facing loneliness, poverty, and indignity outside the protective walls of the palace, their lives often ended in obscurity and hardship.
A harsh end.
It serves as a stark historical reminder of how quickly political favor can evaporate, how ruthlessly power structures can abandon those whose status is rooted solely in utility rather than intrinsic worth or social connection. Their practices and roles, however, did continue to influence court structures, not just in Persia but across the Near East and even into Byzantium and later Islamic courts for millennia, underscoring their profound, complex, and often tragic legacy.
So wrapping this up, the lives of the ancient Persian eunuchs really reveal this incredibly complex tapestry, don't they? It's woven with threads of immense suffering, yes, but also remarkable survival and even moments of unexpected significant influence.
Absolutely. Their story forces us, I think, to look beyond the usual narratives of empire, the glorious battles, the grand monuments, and really recognize the profound human cost that underwrote the stability and even the splendor of the Achaemenid world.
We've traced their journey today, from that brutal, forced selection and transformation through their paradoxical rise as indispensable administrators and guardians at the heart of power.
And ultimately, to their inherent vulnerability, their dependence on the shifting sands of imperial change and favor. They were simultaneously victims of systemic state violence and pivotal actors operating within the highest echelons of that very system. It's a deeply complex picture.
And this deep dive hopefully compels us, and you listening, to acknowledge the individuals behind the label. People who endured incredible physical and psychological pain, who sought community and connection where they could, and who strove for meaning and agency in a world that often seemed determined to define their humanity purely by political calculation.
And this leads us directly to our final thought, something for you to perhaps consider further. The eunuchs, precisely because of their surgically imposed status, inhabited this unique liminal space, a space that fundamentally challenged the traditional, often rigid, binary understandings of gender, family, and power prevalent in ancient Persia.
How so?
By physically manipulating their identity, by altering their bodies to ensure political stability, the Achaemenid state demonstrated the extreme lengths societies might go to construct and enforce its hierarchies. So, the question to ponder is, what can their forced liminal existence teach us today about how contemporary societies might subtly or not so subtly construct and manipulate identity, maybe even bodily definition, to enforce political, social, or economic order?
That's a powerful question.
Their story ultimately isn't just about ancient history. It's a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit when agency is systematically denied, and it highlights the enduring complexity of identity itself, especially when it becomes politicized and controlled by the powerful. Something to think about.